Forgive me, brother.
You have to wake up.
I know what he did. This ends now, Rodrigo.
Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click. But for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance! The millionaire faked a coma until he overheard the maid's confession. The heart monitor beeped slowly, just like always, just like everything in Fulgencio Aldama's life, with a rhythm he himself had set when he chose to. No one in that room knew he was awake. 2 weeks, tops. The old man won't last longer. Rodrigo's voice came from the hallway, soft, almost gentle, as if he were discussing the weather. And in the meantime, I need the board to see someone's in charge, someone they can trust, someone who isn't going to end up stiff in a hospital bed for driving alone at dawn. There was a pause. A short laugh. The man with him. Fulgencio recognized the voice. Gaston Leralde, the corporate lawyer who had signed whatever he ordered for 12 years, also let out a conspiratorial chuckle. A small one. The kind you make when someone says something they shouldn't. But everyone thinks. Fulgencio didn't open his eyes. He counted to 5. Slowly, a lifelong habit. When he was a child, his mother had taught him that trick. Before losing her temper, she'd learned it from necessity, not from any book. When you have nothing, counting gives you time to think. Fulgencio had turned it into a philosophy. In 52 years, he'd never reached 6. Tonight, he reached 11 and kept going without opening his eyes. Aldama Construction had taken 30 years to reach an evaluation of 2.3 billion pesos. 30 years of contracts won through hard work, of meticulously inspected materials, of sleepless nights on projects no one else wanted. 30 years during which Rodrigo had appeared in photos, in presentations, at toasts, always with that wide smile, that perfect tie, that inexplicable talent for showing up just when the heaviest work was already done. Fulgencio had never said it out loud. That was part of the problem. Men like him don't say things. They keep them. They stack them. They turn them into silence, into distance, into a way of walking through the world that people mistake for coldness, but which is actually something else, something closer to fear, though he would never admit it. The accident had been minor in medical terms. The BMW had skidded on the ring road at 2 a.m., hit the median, and Fulgencio had struck his head against the side window. Nothing broken, nothing ruptured. A mild concussion that doctors said required rest and observation. They'd put him in a private room at Hospital Angeles. They'd hooked him up to monitors, told him to rest. And Fulgencio, who in 30 years had never missed a single day at the office, had taken that word, rest, and turned it into a decision. He lay still, closed his eyes, and waited to see what everyone would do when they thought he couldn't see them. He didn't have to wait long to learn things he didn't want to know. Rodrigo had left near midnight after talking with Leralde in the hallway and peeking into the room for 2 minutes. Exactly 2 minutes. Fulgencio counted them to see his older brother with a well-rehearsed look of pity. Then he left. His footsteps in the corridor sounded almost cheerful. The night nurse came in to check the monitors at 1:15 a.m. She left without a sound. At 2:15 a.m., the room was completely silent, and then the door opened very slowly, as if the person on the other side were afraid of waking someone. Fulgencio knew that sound, that door, that carefulness. It was her, Refugio Tlaloc, Cuca, as they'd called her since she was a child. Although no one in this house used that nickname because no one in this house asked what they'd called her since she was a child, she entered with a glass of water no one had asked for and stood by the door for a moment, looking at the bed. She had been working in the Lomas de Chapultepec mansion for 8 months. She had arrived with a letter of recommendation that was half truth and half desperation, with a change of clothes and a cloth bag and a debt from her father that wasn't hers, but which had somehow become her problem. As always, Fulgencio had hired her without asking more questions than necessary. He'd told her the salary, explained the house rules, given her the keys to the service wing, and hadn't spoken to her directly again in almost 2 months. For Cuca, that had been enough, more than enough. She had worked in houses where the man did speak to her directly, and none of those conversations had ended well. She approached the bedside table, placed the glass of water, and stood there, hands clasped in front of her stomach, looking at the face of this man, who in real life never looked like this, without a clenched jaw, without a furrowed brow, without that constant tension he carried, as if the world were a pending debt. Asleep, or what she thought was asleep. Fulgencio Aldama looked like another person. He looked like someone for whom life had been a heavy burden. Cuca looked at him for a long time, then at the monitor, then back at him. "I know you can't hear me," she said very softly, almost to herself. "But I still feel bad leaving you alone like this, with just the silence." She pulled the chair by the window, dragging it noiselessly until it was about 1.5 meters from the bed. She sat down, clasped her hands in her lap, and began to speak. At first she talked about small things, about how much it had rained that afternoon, about how Don Abundio, the mansion's doorman, had tried to fix the planter in the hall that had been broken since January and had ended up spilling dirt all over the entrance. And then she said aloud, believing no one could hear her, "Well, it's back to how it was, but now with more dirt on the floor. What can you do?" Cuca smiled at the memory, a small, almost invisible smile. Fulgencio, behind his closed eyelids, heard her and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A desire to smile too. He held it back. He counted to 3. He remained still. Cuca spoke a little longer. Then she fell silent. Then she spoke again, this time more slowly, with a different tone, like when your voice changes without you wanting it to, because something you were holding in slips out without permission. "My mother used to say that when someone is unconscious, they can still hear everything," she said. "I don't know if it's true. Probably not. You're the kind of man who doesn't believe in those things." A pause. "I don't know if I believe it either, but I like to think so, that sometimes people are there, even if they can't say it." The monitor continued its rhythm. Cuca looked at her hands. "I hope you get well soon, Mrs. Aldama," she said with a sincerity that felt unfeigned. "Not because I'll be out of work, but because—" She paused, took a breath. "Because the house feels strange without you, empty, and that's even though you never said much." Fulgencio tightened his fingers slightly under the sheet. No one saw it. Cuca got up around 3 a.m., put the chair back in its place, picked up the intact glass of water from the bedside table. At the door, she paused for a second without turning around. "Good night, sir," she said, and left. The door closed with the same care with which it had opened. Fulgencio remained alone in the silence of the room. The monitor kept beeping. The city kept moving outside, blind and enormous. And for the first time in many years, a man who never asked for anything wondered what would have happened if he had ever learned to ask. He didn't arrive at any answer, but the question remained there, floating in the air of that hospital room, bothersome and new, like a crack in a wall you thought was solid. What would you do if you discovered that the only person who came to the hospital out of pure will was someone you had never paid attention to? But then, before I tell you what happened next, if this story already has your heart aching, imagine what's coming. Like and subscribe so you don't miss any chapters. Refugio Tilak had learned not to take up space. It wasn't philosophy, it wasn't humility, it was a skill learned when life teaches you very early that occupying space has consequences, that asking costs, that asking, above all, always comes at a high price. She had learned it in Tlacolula, Oaxaca, in a house where money trickled in and disappeared in drinks. Her father, Aurelio Tlahac, was a good man when he was sober, and a problem when he wasn't. And the problem was that you rarely saw him sober. Her mother had endured 20 years before her heart gave out. Not from sadness, like in songs, but from real cardiac clinical exhaustion. A heart attack at 44. Cuca was 16. From that night on, the weight of the household fell on her, and Cuca carried it without complaint because there was no one else, and because that was how things worked in her world. Women carried, men promised, and life went on. At 21, her father had signed a debt with a moneylender from Miahuatlan, 80,000 pesos, for a business that never opened with a partner who disappeared in 3 weeks. Aurelio had tried to pay for 6 months. Then he stopped trying. The debt was still there. Cuca found it one night while looking through papers in the tin box where her father kept important documents. It had been found in her name. She was 23. She had signed something she didn't remember signing. Her father had probably forged it, probably without malice, probably convinced he would resolve it before it mattered. He hadn't resolved it. And Cuca, who hadn't been surprised by anything in years, had sat on the floor of that small kitchen and cried for exactly 4 minutes. Then she had gotten up, put the papers away, and started looking for work in Mexico City. That was what had brought her to this house. Not ambition, not a plan, but a debt that wasn't hers and a skill for not taking up space that made her a good domestic employee. The mansion in Lomas was another world, not in a poetic sense, but in a literal sense. Another language, another temperature, another way of moving through spaces. Rooms had names, the tableware had a history, the garden had a full-time gardener named Elir, who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the first time Cuca saw him working, she thought she had never seen anyone so serious pruning bushes. The first few days she spent learning where not to look. Fulgencio Aldama had breakfast at exactly 7 a.m., a physical newspaper, black coffee, no conversation. The first morning, Cuca had gone in to clean the dining room, thinking he had already left, and found him still standing by the window, with the phone in his hand, his gaze fixed on the street. She had said, "Excuse me, sir. I'm leaving." And he had said, "It's all right. Finish what you were going to do without looking at me." And that had been enough. Not a shout, not a comment, not a look that made you feel like you were in the way. Just, "It's all right. Finish what you were going to do." Cuca had finished cleaning the dining room with more care than ever. Do you know what the worst part of falling in love with someone who doesn't see you is? That you can't even be angry, because the person never promised you anything, never pretended, never gave you a reason. They simply existed near you, being who they were, distant, serious, with that weight they never explained. And you, without permission and without warning, started to notice things you shouldn't. Cuca had noticed everything. How his jaw tensed when a call from his brother came. How he took exactly 20 minutes for breakfast. Never 19. Never 21. How the only time she had heard him truly laugh, not the polite laughter of a gathering, not the courteous laughter, had been when Don Abundio, completely by accident, had mistaken the CEO of a partner company for the new cook and asked him if the soup of the day was ready. Fulgencio's laughter that day lasted only 3 seconds, but it was real. Cuca kept it as if it were her own. She wasn't foolish. She knew exactly what she was. She was the housekeeper. She came from Oaxaca. She had a debt under her name and an extra change of clothes. He was the owner of a construction company valued at over 2 billion pesos, with a name that appeared in business magazines and a way of entering a room that made people straighten up without him saying a word. There was no possible story there. She knew it, and she loved him anyway, without expectation, without seeking it, in the most useless and inconvenient way possible. In silence, without telling anyone, without expecting anything. A love that didn't ask, because she had learned that asking comes at a cost. On Wednesday of the second week, 5 days before the accident, Rodrigo Aldama had arrived at the mansion without announcing himself. Cuca knew him by sight. He had been to the house 2 or 3 times since she arrived, always with that smile of those who know they are handsome and have decided that's an argument, always with a funny story ready, always with that talent for filling a room with his own presence, as if the air belonged to him. That afternoon he walked into the kitchen while she was preparing the Lord's chicken broth. Fulgencio had been eating chicken broth on Wednesdays for as long as she could remember, without ever asking for it, because one day she had seen him arrive drenched in rain and had assumed broth would fix the world, and she had been right. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Hey," he said, as if they had known each other for years. "How has my brother been lately? Sleeping well? Eating well? Has he said anything about the company?" Cuca continued stirring the pot. "The master is well, thank you," she said. "I don't usually comment on his affairs." Rodrigo let out a short, charmed laugh, the kind used when someone says something unexpected. "How professional." He took 2 steps closer. "Hey, I'm not asking you to spy on him. I'm just asking, we're family, aren't we? I worry about him." "Of course," Cuca replied, continuing without looking at him. Rodrigo lingered for a moment longer, calibrating, then left. Cuca waited until his footsteps receded down the corridor. Then she turned down the heat on the pot, then exhaled the breath she had been holding without realizing it. That man gave her a bad feeling. The kind of bad feeling you can't explain, but your body registers before your head does. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning. Fulgencio had left without saying where. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the time, and that he had left his phone on the tray by the entrance, something he never did. Cuca had seen it as she passed, and had left it there because it wasn't its place. At 4 a.m., the house's landline rang. It was the hospital. Don Abundio had answered, listened, hung up, and then stood frozen in the central hallway, saying aloud, without realizing Cuca was coming down the stairs at that moment, "Oh my God, The master crashed. And now, who's in charge here? Cuca had arrived at the hospital at 5:10, before Rodrigo, before Heralde, before anyone on Fulgencio's contact list. Not because it was her duty, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she was the only one who had wanted to go. She had sat in the waiting room for 3 hours with her hands clasped and her body rigid, not knowing what to do with her fear. The doctors had come out at 8 a.m. to say the contusion was minor, that the master was stable, that he would likely wake up soon. Cuca had said thank you, her voice coming out smaller than she expected. Then she had called Don Abundio to inform him. Then she had called the cook. Then she had sat there without calling anyone else, because there was no one else to call who was from her side. Rodrigo had arrived at 9:15 with Leralde, and 2 people she didn't know. He had looked at Cuca in the waiting room with something that wasn't exactly surprise, more like calculation, a split second of calculation, and then he had offered a smile. Have you been here long? Since 5, Cuca said. So dedicated, Rodrigo said. And he walked into the corridor of rooms without looking at her again. That night, when everyone had left, and the hospital had fallen silent in the early hours, Cuca had re-entered the room. She had no plan, no prepared speech. She had an unconscious man, or so she thought, in a hospital bed, and a weight in her chest she didn't know where to put, and she spoke. Tomorrow I'll speak more, because some things build up so much they find their way out on their own, at the worst possible moment, with the worst possible witness, or the best, depending on how you look at it. Wait, because you won't believe what's coming now. It was 2:17 in the morning. The hospital corridor was empty. The night nurse had passed by to check the monitors 20 minutes earlier, and wouldn't be back until 4. The city outside continued with its usual dull roar, that background noise that never stops, like a huge, distracted breath. The door opened with its usual care. Fulgencio recognized it before he heard her steps. There was something in the way she opened doors, as if the world on the other side were fragile, and she didn't want to break it. Cuca entered. She placed a small brown paper bag on the bedside table. It smelled of pan de muerto, even though it wasn't the season, the kind sold at the bakery in Colonia Roma that's open 24 hours. She pulled up a chair, sat down, and said nothing for a long while. Fulgencio waited, counting the seconds unconsciously, reaching 43 before she spoke. I saw your brother in the hallway today, she said. Her voice was calm, too calm, the kind that costs effort. He was talking to Mr. Leralde, and another gentleman I don't know. They had some folders. Pause. I don't like the way he looks at things when he thinks no one is watching. Your brother looks at everything as if he's taking inventory. The monitor continued its rhythm. Cuca looked at her hands. Maybe I'm wrong, she said. Maybe it's me looking for flaws because I disliked him from the start. That's possible too. But I don't believe it. Fulgencio didn't speak for a while either, about small things, like the previous night, how Eleazar, the gardener, had asked about him that afternoon, with few words, but with genuine concern, standing at the gate with his hat in his hand. How the cook, Doña Herminia, had made Wednesday's chicken broth anyway, even though there was no one to eat it, and then had shared it with her and Don Abundio in the kitchen, and the 3 of them had sat without talking much because they didn't know what to say. Don Abundio said you once lent him money when his daughter was sick, Cuca said. That you never charged him, and when he brought it up, you said you didn't know what he was talking about. A brief pause. He knows you did, but he says that's how good men are. They do things, and then pretend they didn't so the other person doesn't feel indebted. Silence. I think he's right, Cuca said softly. Fulgencio tightened his fingers under the sheet very lightly. No one saw it. Then there was a different silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has too much and is searching to see if they will truly let it go. Cuca looked at the window, the city outside, dark and illuminated at the same time. I'm going to tell you something, she said at last, very slowly, as if gathering momentum. Something I wouldn't tell you if I didn't think you could hear me. And if it turns out you can hear, well, I've let it out. So be it. Fulgencio didn't breathe. I love you, Cuca said. Just like that. Without preamble, without construction. Like someone dropping something heavy they can no longer carry. Not in the way one can love. Not in the way that makes sense. Her voice cracked a little, and she recovered it immediately with the practice of years of not letting herself go completely. You are my employer. I am your employee. I come from Oaxaca, with a debt under my name, and a cloth bag. Your name appears in magazines. That's not a story. That's not even a possibility. The monitor beeped. But she continued. Still, I love you. Ever since I saw you lend Don Abundio money and then pretend you didn't. Ever since I heard you laugh. Truly, truly laugh. Not that laugh you use in meetings. Ever since one time I saw you standing in the garden at 6 a.m., looking at the plants, as if you needed them to exist. She took a breath. You carry something very heavy, Mrs. Aldama. I don't know what it is, but I've seen you carry it every day, and I've never seen you take it off. Cuca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Quickly, as if correcting a mistake. I'm not asking for anything, she clarified firmly. I'm not one to ask. I just wanted to tell someone, even if that someone can't hear me. A pause. It will pass, or it won't pass, but I'll learn to carry it like I carry everything else. It's not your problem. You don't even know my real name. There she was mistaken. Fulgencio. He did know her real name. Refugio. Cuca as a child. He had read it on her file when he hired her and had kept it without knowing why. Now he knew why. Cuca remained silent for another moment, then took the bread out of the paper bag, placed it on the bedside table next to the glass of water, and looked at it. I brought you bread, she said, her voice now almost normal. I know you can't eat it right now, but it seems strange to come empty-handed. She stood up, adjusted the chair, and paused at the door. This time she did turn back, just for a moment, to look at the bed. I hope he wakes up soon, she said. And I hope when he wakes up, someone tells him he doesn't have to keep carrying all that alone. A small pause. Although I know that even if they tell him, you won't pay attention. That's how men like you are. She left. The door closed. Fulgencio opened his eyes. Just for a second, just to see the white ceiling of the room, the blinking monitor, the paper bag with the bread on the bedside table. He closed them again. He counted to 20. He didn't reach it because somewhere between 8 and 9, something that had been held tightly in the center of his chest for decades shifted. It didn't break. It didn't explode. It just moved like a knot loosening a millimeter. Just enough for a little air to get in. Fulgencio Aldama, who had never asked for anything, who had never let anyone see him, who had built an empire on not needing anyone. That man had been pretending to be unconscious for 3 days, and the only person who had come to see him at night without being asked was a girl from Oaxaca who had brought him pan de muerto out of season and told him she loved him without asking for anything in return. He didn't know what to do with it. He had no category for it, but it was there. At 4 a.m., when the nurse came in to check the monitors, she found the usual patient, still, stable, breathing slowly. She didn't find the expression that lay beneath his closed eyelids. Something similar, very distantly, akin to shame, the good kind. The kind that comes when you realize someone has seen you better than you've seen yourself. And meanwhile, on the floor below, in the waiting room that closed at 10, but had a corner with chairs by the elevators where no one bothered you, Rodrigo Aldama was speaking in a low voice with Gaston Lerelde as they reviewed documents by the light of their phones. By Thursday, Rodrigo said, I need the board signatures, the outstanding ones. There are 4 counselors who will ask questions, Lerelde said. That's what we pay them for, Rodrigo said, and he turned the page. Time was running out, and Fulgencio was still deciding how much longer he would remain still. The next day, Rodrigo arrived at the hospital at 10 a.m. with a new tie and a smile that looked rehearsed in the mirror. He entered the room, looked at his brother, placed a hand on Fulgencio's shoulder with a pressure that intended to be affectionate and was, in reality, a check. Stay still. Stay unobtrusive. Stay out of the way. How are you, brother? He said, though it wasn't a question. The monitor answered for Fulgencio. Rodrigo nodded, satisfied, took out his phone, and began scrolling through messages, standing by the bed, as if he were waiting for a taxi, and Fulgencio were part of the scenery. 3 minutes to the exact second. Then he left. Fulgencio heard him recede down the hallway. He heard him greet the nurse with a joke. He heard the nurse laugh. Rodrigo had always known when to laugh and when to make others laugh. It was his most dangerous talent. At 11:30, Cuca arrived. Not in the dead of night this time, but in broad daylight, in her uniform, because she had come straight from the mansion after finishing cleaning the main wing. She brought a bag of fruit he probably couldn't eat either, but which she placed on the bedside table, with the naturalness of someone doing what makes sense, even if it's not practical. She sat down, took a small book from her apron pocket, a paperback novel with a colorful cover and large print. Fulgencio couldn't see the title, but he could hear the pages turn as she flipped through them. She didn't speak to him, just stayed there reading, a silent companion, without making it a grand gesture. Fulgencio hadn't realized until that moment that such a thing was possible, that someone could be with you without demanding that you acknowledge their presence. 40 minutes later, Rodrigo returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought a woman in a gray suit, her hair pulled back, an attitude that suggested she billed by the hour, likely another lawyer or consultant, or one of those titles that exist to put a pretty name on doing something someone else doesn't want to sign off on directly. He saw Cuca sitting by the bed and paused at the doorway for a moment. That fraction of a second of calculation that Cuca had already described the night before, and which Fulgencio could now see confirmed from the inside, with his eyelids closed and his senses wide open. "Hey," Rodrigo said, his voice as warm as ever. "Glad you're here. Could you give us a moment? We need to talk about family matters, delicate things." A pause. "Of course," Cuca said. She closed the book and stood up. Wait, Rodrigo said, his tone shifting to something even friendlier, almost confidential. "Hey, have you noticed anything odd in the days before the accident? How was my brother? How did he seem to you?" A brief silence. "Fine," Cuca said. "He seemed fine. He wasn't stressed. He wasn't saying anything that would stand out. Anything about the company? About decisions he wanted to make?" Cuca didn't answer immediately. Fulgencio knew that silence. It was the silence of someone choosing their words, not because they don't know what to say, but because they know exactly what they want to say and are deciding if it's worth it. "I'm a housekeeper, Mr. Rodrigo," she said finally. "Mr. Aldama doesn't tell me company matters." Right. Rodrigo's smile didn't waver. "I'm just asking." A pause. "Hey, and how long have you been with us?" 8 months? As if he didn't know. "You've been very dedicated, very present. It shows you care about the family. That's worth a lot." The space between those words was filled with something that was not words. "Thank you," Cuca said, and left. In the hallway, Don Abundio sat in a plastic chair by the elevator, his hat on his knees, his face that of someone who had been waiting for hours without knowing exactly why. He had come by subway from Lomas, because he said he couldn't stay home knowing the boss was in the hospital, and if he couldn't do anything useful, at least he could be close. When Cuca left the room, Don Abundio looked at her and said, in a perfectly audible voice, "And the little brother, is he tired of pretending to be worried, or is he still inside?" Cuca looked at him. Don Abundio realized he had spoken aloud. He adjusted his hat on his knees with dignity. "I just thought it," he clarified, and walked away. "Tone it down a bit, Don Abundio," Cuca said quietly. "Minimum," he replied, but lowered his voice. Inside the room, behind the closed door, Fulgencio Aldama suppressed something that, in another context, in another life, would have been a laugh. That afternoon, when the hospital settled into the quiet lull after lunch, and Rodrigo had left with his lawyer to some place where decisions are made with expensive pens, Cuca entered again. She sat down, didn't take out her book. "He asked me strange things," she said without preamble. "Your brother. He wanted to know what you had said to him." A pause. "I told him nothing, because I have nothing to tell him." "You never told me anything," she continued, referring to the monitor. "But it seems strange to me, the way he asked, as if he needed me to say something specific." She bit her lip. "I don't know, maybe I'm imagining things." She wasn't imagining anything. Fulgencio knew it, and he couldn't say it. That powerlessness, the one of knowing and being unable to act, of seeing the danger from within his own chosen silence, was beginning to exact a price he hadn't calculated at the outset. "Do you know what I thought today?" Cuca said after a while. Her voice had changed, calmer, almost curious. "I thought that you and I are alike in something." Fulgencio waited. "We both carry things that aren't ours," she said. "You carry a company you built alone, while someone else took the credit. I carry a debt my father signed. We both learned not to complain." A pause. "The difference is that you were taught that was strength. I was taught there was no other way." Silence. "I don't know which of us is worse," Cuca said. Fulgencio didn't know either. And the fact that a girl from Oaxaca with a cloth bag and someone else's debt could say aloud what he hadn't been able to name in 52 years was exactly the kind of thing his ego had no answer for. At 6 p.m., Doña Epifania arrived, 81 years old, Fulgencio's great-aunt on his mother's side, 1.54 meters of person, and 180 kilograms of character. No one had told her. No one ever told Doña Epifania anything, because Doña Epifania already knew everything before being told, for reasons that science hasn't fully explained. She entered the room, looked at the bed, looked at the monitors, looked at Cuca, who had automatically stood up. "Sit down, child," Doña Epifania said without looking at her. "There's no protocol here." Then she approached the bed, looked at Fulgencio with narrowed eyes, her head tilted, like someone examining something that raises reasonable doubts. She said. Just that. She sat in the other chair, the one opposite Cuca, took a holy card of the Virgin of Guadalupe from her purse, and placed it on the bedside table next to the bread and fruit. Then she took out a tamarind candy, unwrapped it, put it in her mouth, and stared at the monitor with the expression of someone who has already seen much more complicated things than that. Cuca didn't know what to say. "Are you the one who comes at night?" Doña Epifania asked without turning. Cuca opened her mouth, then closed it. "Yes, ma'am," she finally said. Doña Epifania repeated, and said nothing more, but she gave Fulgencio another glance, a long one, the kind that sees more than it should. Then she looked at Cuca, then back at the monitor. "Good," she said, apparently to no one. Fulgencio, behind his eyelids, felt as if he had been discovered. He didn't know which of them. That night, much later, when Doña Epifania had left with her purse and her unimpeachable judgment, and Cuca was about to get up to leave as well, Rodrigo appeared at the door once more, looked at his brother, looked at Cuca. "How dedicated," he repeated, the same tone as in the morning, but this time there was something else within those words, something that smelled of strategy. "Good evening, Mr. Rodrigo," Cuca said. She left before he could say anything else. In the hallway, Don Abundio was still in his plastic chair. He had spent the entire day there, going back and forth to the bathroom and the cafeteria, and when he saw Rodrigo peek out of the room's door, he said quite loudly, "There's the little brother again. Lord, how interested he's become." Rodrigo looked at him. Don Abundio looked back with total innocence. "Good evening," Don Abundio said with impeccable dignity. That night, Fulgencio didn't sleep, not because he couldn't, but because there was too much stirring within him for sleep to find a place. A woman who loved him without asking for anything, a brother who was betraying him with a smile, a great aunt who probably already knew everything and was waiting to see how long it would take him to react, and a 68-year-old doorman who was the only one in that hospital who said aloud what everyone was thinking. Fulgencio had built his entire life on control, on knowing more than others, and staying silent more than others, and acting at the exact right moment. But this he hadn't calculated. This had no manual. And somewhere in that room, in silence, between the beeping of the monitor and the out-of-season pan de muerto and the holy card, the virgin someone had left on the bedside table, Fulgencio Aldama was beginning to understand that the problem had never been the world. The problem was that he had mistaken silence for strength, and they were not the same. And what would you have done? Would you have kept pretending, or would you have gotten up already? Thursday arrived with fog. Fulgencio knew it from the sound of the city outside, more muffled than usual, as if the noise itself were wrapped in something. He had been in that bed for 4 days. 4 days of listening, 4 days of accumulating information, with the patience of someone who has learned that acting at the wrong moment costs more than waiting. But Thursday had a different weight. He felt it from early on, before anyone arrived, in the way the footsteps in the hallway were different, faster, more decisive, like when people move because something is about to happen, and they don't want to be late. At 9:40, Rodrigo entered the room. He brought only Heralde, the woman in the gray suit from the previous days, and a man whom Fulgencio identified by his voice, before he said anything. Edmundo Vargas, chairman of the board of directors of Constructora Aldama, 63 years old, 4 decades in the business world, a man who had seen many things and who didn't like to be surprised. "Edmundo, thank you for coming," Rodrigo said, using that host's voice he employed when he wanted the other person to feel they were doing him a favor by being there. "You see how he is. The doctors say it could be weeks. During this time, the company cannot be without executive direction. The board knows. You know." There was a pause. "The documentation is in order," Harold said, handing over something. "Paper, several sheets." Fulgencio heard the rustle. "It's a temporary transfer of powers. While Mr. Aldama recovers, Rodrigo will assume general management with full powers to operate, sign contracts, and represent the company. Temporary, Edmundo Vargas repeated. It wasn't a question. It was the word you say when something sounds wrong, but you don't yet have the argument to explain why. Completely temporary, Rodrigo said. His smile was perfect. As soon as Fulgencio wakes up and is able, everything will return to normal. I just want the company not to suffer in the meantime. It's what he would have wanted, what he would have wanted. Fulgencio counted to 15. He reached 15. He kept counting. Edmundo Vargas took a moment. I need to review it with the other board members, he said finally. Give me until Monday. Monday, Rodrigo repeated, a tone of calculated concern. Edmundo, there are contracts expiring this week. There are suppliers waiting for signatures. Every day the company operates without formal direction is a legal risk we will all regret. Another silence. Friday, Vargas said. By Friday at the latest. Rodrigo nodded, satisfied, his smile intact. The three of them left. Heralde closed the door, and Fulgencio was left alone in that room, with the sound of the monitor, the fog outside, and the certainty that the time he thought he had just shrunk to less than 48 hours. Cuca arrived at noon, her lunch wrapped in foil. She'd been eating half her days at the hospital that week, between visits, in forgotten corners, her expression taut, like when something worries you but you're not sure if you have a right to be. She sat, didn't pull out her book, didn't make small talk. This morning I saw the folders Mr. Loraldi brought, she said. She'd left them on the hallway chair for a moment while on the phone. I didn't read anything, I'm not like that, but I saw the letterhead. It was from a notary, and below it said something about powers of attorney. A pause. I don't know exactly what it means, but it gave me a bad feeling. Fulgencio listened. I told Don Abundio, Cuca continued. And he said, well, that means they're going to take the company from the man while he's asleep. And he said it loudly in the visitor's hallway, in front of 3 people we didn't know. Then he fell silent and said, Oops, did I say that or did I think it? A pause. You said it, Cuca confirmed. Inside the room, in bed, Fulgencio Aldama felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A desire to fix something, not to control it, not to manage it from afar, but to stand up, to move, to put everything in its place. Not yet, but soon. What Cuca didn't know, what no one knew yet, not even herself, was that 3 days earlier, while waiting in the hallway for Rodrigo's visit to end, she had left her phone on the chair without locking the screen, and the phone had continued recording. It was a function that had activated itself, one of those things phones do when they detect continuous movement, and the user has accidentally enabled voice note recording. Cuca used that function to dictate her grocery lists. Sometimes she forgot to turn it off. That afternoon, as Rodrigo spoke with Liralde in the hallway with the door ajar, Cuca's phone had recorded 17 minutes of conversation. She didn't know it. The phone remained in her bag, silent, holding something she didn't yet know she possessed. At 4 p.m., Rodrigo did something Fulgencio hadn't expected. He returned to the room alone, without lawyers, without assistants, without the usual armor of people that made him seem more important than he was. He sat in the chair next to the bed, Cuca's chair, though he didn't know it, and stared at his brother for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. It wasn't the voice of introduction. It wasn't the voice of a broker or a boardroom. It was something closer to the voice they had when they were children. Rodrigo was 12, and Fulgencio was 16. They both slept in the same room of a house that was always on the verge of losing power. Do you know what's funny? Rodrigo said softly. That you never asked me if I wanted this. The company, the name, the whole burden. You just assumed it all and left me in the role of the one who arrives when it's already done. A long pause. And maybe you were right. Maybe I wouldn't have been able to. But you never asked me. Silence. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Rodrigo clarified. Nor am I giving it. I just stopped. He stood up. Nothing. Why did he leave? Fulgencio was left with those words floating in the room. They didn't justify him. They didn't absolve him. Rodrigo was going to sign those documents on Friday anyway. That hadn't changed. But there was some truth in what he had said. A small, uncomfortable truth. The kind you prefer not to hear because it implies you also bear some responsibility for the disaster. Fulgencio filed it away for later. There were more urgent matters now. That night, Cuca arrived late, past 1 a.m. She entered the room with less care than other nights. Not carelessly, but like someone carrying a weight they haven't found a place for. She sat. It took her a moment. Rodrigo called me this afternoon, she said. He called my phone. He said he wanted to thank me for my dedication to the Señor, that it spoke well of me, that he would be in charge of the company soon, and would like to have loyal people around him. A pause. He said there would be a significant raise, and that I just needed to say, if anyone on the board asked, that Mr. Aldama had been acting erratically and forgetfully in recent months. The monitor out. I told him no, Cuca said. Without drama, without embellishment, just that. He said, think about it. I told him, I've already thought about it, and I hung up. Cuca looked at the bed, at that still man who had been the silent witness to everything happening around him for days. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, she said, with an honesty that sought no answer. I don't know if it's my place to get involved. You never asked me to defend you. I have nothing to do with the company or the family or anything. I'm the employee. A pause. But I'm not going to lie, she said. Not for money, not for a raise, not for anything. She said it without heroism, like someone stating a fact. Fulgencio heard this and understood something that had taken him 52 years to grasp. True loyalty cannot be bought or demanded or built with contracts. It simply exists in some people as part of who they are, without anyone asking for it. He had built a company worth 2.3 billion pesos, surrounded by people who signed whatever he told them, and the only loyal person in that hospital slept in a hallway chair when it got late, brought him pan de muerto out of season, and refused bribes without a second thought. I have a feeling things will happen tomorrow, Cuca said, getting up to leave. I don't know what, but something. At the door she paused. As always, this time she said nothing, just looked at him for a moment, at the man who couldn't return her gaze, or so she thought. And she nodded slightly, like when you say goodbye to something you know is changing. She left, the door closed, and Fulgencio Aldama opened his eyes in the darkness of the empty room, looked at the ceiling, and made a decision. Tomorrow the silence would end. Friday dawned without fog. Cuca realized it before opening her eyes by the way the light entered differently through the hospital hallway window, cleaner, more direct, like those days when the sky decides, without consulting anyone, that it's had enough of hiding. She had been sitting for 3 hours in the plastic chair by the elevator. She had fallen asleep there around 4 a.m., her book closed on her lap, her head against the wall, and when she woke up, her neck was stiff, and Don Abundio was sitting 2 chairs away with 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine, and a face that suggested he had been waiting a long time for something, without knowing what. He passed her one of the coffees without a word. Cuca accepted it without a word. That was how they were, people of useful silences. At 7:15, Cuca entered the room. Nothing had happened. Fulgencio was in bed, still as always. The monitor showing its rhythm, the room in the same daily silence. She arranged the fruit on the bedside table, already quite ripe, it would need changing. And she sat down. Today is the day, her brother said, she said, without preamble. On Friday, Mr. Vargas arrives, and they sign. The monitor. I don't know what will happen, Cuca said, but I'm here. 3 words. Unadorned, without argument, without a promise of anything she couldn't fulfill. I'm here. Fulgencio heard them, let them linger. At 9:15, Rodrigo arrived. This time in a dark suit, the one he wore for investor presentations. Tie, hair styled with the kind of order that requires a mirror and time, and a very clear idea of the impression one wants to make. He entered the room, looked at his brother, looked at Cuca. Good morning, he said. Polite, impeccable. Could you give us a moment? Cuca stood up, took her bag from the hook on the chair, and it was then, as she adjusted the bag on her shoulder, that her phone slipped, falling to the floor. The screen didn't break. Those cheap silicone cases sometimes work miracles, but as it fell, it unlocked, and when Cuca picked it up and checked it, she saw something she hadn't expected. An active voice note recording, 17 minutes and 42 seconds. From 3 days ago. Cuca frowned. She didn't understand. She pressed play without thinking, with the volume low, almost against her ear, and heard 3 seconds of audio that made her freeze completely. Rodrigo's voice. Laralde's voice. A conversation in the hallway with the door ajar 3 days earlier. Rodrigo noticed she wasn't moving. Everything all right? He said, with the tone of someone asking without caring about the answer. Yes, Cuca said. She put the phone away. Excuse me. She went out into the hallway. She walked to the chair by the elevator. She sat down, put on her headphones, pressed play from the beginning. Don Abundio looked at her. She gestured with her hand. Wait. She listened. 17 minutes and 42 seconds of conversation between Rodrigo Aldama and Gaston Leralde, accidentally recorded by a forgotten phone in a hospital hallway chair with the voice note function activated. Rodrigo saying the incapacity documents were ready, that they just needed 2 doctors to sign them and that was already arranged. Leralde asking what would happen if Fulgencio woke up before Friday. Rodrigo responding, if he wakes up, we'll give him another 3 days of sedative. The anesthesiologist already knows we're paying him well. This can't fail now that we're so close. Leralde, after a long pause. And the employee? The one who goes to the hospital at night, Rodrigo. I'm handling her. I'll offer her enough to cooperate. And if she doesn't cooperate, I'll fire her as soon as I have control of the company. She doesn't have papers to protect her. She has no one to call. People like that don't cause problems when they understand their position. Leralde and Vargas. Rodrigo. Vargas signs whatever you put in front of him if the argument is sufficiently legal. He doesn't want problems, he just wants the ship to keep floating. Then laughter, then footsteps receding, then silence. Cuca took off her headphones, sat with the phone in her hands, the hospital noise around her, and a strange clarity in her head. The kind of clarity that arrives when something you didn't understand suddenly clicks into place, and the full picture is worse than you imagined, but at least you now know what you're seeing. He was being sedated. He wasn't in a coma. He hadn't lost consciousness from the accident. He was being medicated to keep him asleep while they took away what he had built. Don Abundio looked at her. What happened? He said, his voice perfectly audible in the entire hallway. Keep your voice down, Cuca said. What happened? Don Abundio repeated, at exactly the same volume. Cuca leaned towards him and whispered what she had heard. Don Abundio's face changed as she spoke. First confusion, then indignation, then an expression of war that Cuca had never seen on him before, and she remembered that this man had done his military service in 1976. And now what do we do? Don Abundio said. I need to think, Cuca said. Think fast, Don Abundio said, because the little brother is inside with the senor, and something doesn't feel right. It took Cuca 3 minutes to decide. 3 minutes sitting in that plastic chair with the phone in her hands and her heart beating faster than she liked. She thought about calling someone. Who? She didn't know anyone at the company. She didn't know the board members. She didn't know any lawyers. She was the domestic employee from Lomas de Chapultepec with debt in her name and a cloth bag. Then she thought of Doña Epifania, 81 years old, 1.54 meters tall, 180 kilograms of character, and a phone book that the lady kept in a physical notebook because she said smartphones were for people who didn't trust their own memory. Cuca looked up the number on her phone. Doña Epifania had given it to her on the first day without her asking, with the calm of someone who knows they will be needed. She dialed, and the phone was answered on the second ring. I'm already late, Doña Epifania said before Cuca could say anything. Cuca blinked. How does she know? She asked. Because you've been staring at that boy for 3 days, with a look that says something's not quite right, and I've spent 81 years learning to recognize that look. What did you find? Doña Epifania arrived 40 minutes later, not alone. She brought a tall man, about 60, with white hair, and a way of walking that commanded space without asking permission. She introduced him with 4 words. My nephew, a criminal lawyer. The man extended his hand to Cuca. Norberto Villanueva, he said. My aunt called me half an hour ago, saying she needed an urgent favor. She doesn't ask for favors, which is why I'm here. Doña Epifania, beside him, unwrapped another tamarind candy with the calm of someone who already has everything under control. The phone, she said to Cuca. Show it to Norberto. Norberto Villanueva listened to the entire recording with headphones on, his face as neutral as someone who has heard worse, but knows precisely when something is significant. When he finished, he took off the headphones and handed them back to Cuca. Induced sedation without consent, he stated. That's illegal deprivation of liberty. The manipulation of notarial documents with false witnesses is fraud. Conspiracy to strip someone of their assets through fabricated incapacity is a federal offense. He paused. I need to speak with the attending physician, and I need no one to enter that room for the next 20 minutes. I'll handle that, said Don Abundio, with a seriousness no one had seen in his 30 years as a doorman. He went to stand in front of the room's door, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who wouldn't move even by presidential decree. Inside the room, Rodrigo was still on the phone, unaware of what was happening outside. He didn't know that the phone of a domestic worker from Oaxaca, carried in a cloth bag, had accidentally recorded exactly what they needed. He didn't know his great-aunt had arrived with a criminal lawyer. He didn't know the time he thought he had was up. What he did know, what he was about to discover, in the worst possible way, was that the most elaborate conspiracies often crumble due to the smallest detail. A phone, a recording function accidentally activated, a young woman who didn't know what she had in her bag. That's how justice sometimes works, not like lightning, but like a 17-minute voice note no one remembered recording. Norberto Villanueva took 12 minutes to speak with the attending physician. Cuca didn't hear the conversation. It took place in the adjacent room with the door closed. But she heard the silence that followed, the kind of silence that precedes decisions someone didn't want to have to make. The doctor came out first, his face pale, his steps quick towards the nursing station. Norberto followed. He approached Cuca. "The anesthesiologist mentioned in the recording is on duty until 2, he said in a low voice. "The attending physician is going to suspend the sedative right now. In an hour or two, Mr. Aldama should start waking up naturally." He paused. "I need no one to enter that room who isn't medical personnel. No family, no company personnel." "Understood. Understood," said Cuca. "Don Abundio." "You know the drill," said Norberto, looking at the doorman who remained planted in front of the door, arms crossed, with the expression of a national monument. "Don Abundio always knows," said Cuca. What no one knew, what Cuca wouldn't know until much later, was that Fulgencio Aldama hadn't needed the sedative for 2 days. He had been medicated in the first few days, yes, but his body had metabolized it faster than the anesthesiologist had calculated. Since Tuesday, Fulgencio had been awake of his own volition, not due to any substance. He had chosen to stay, he had heard everything. And when the doctor entered the room at 10:40 a.m. on Friday to suspend the sedation, Fulgencio had to restrain himself from telling him he was a little late. He remained still a while longer, because there was something he wanted to do before opening his eyes to the world. He wanted to remember his mother. It wasn't something he did often. Men like him, those who learned very early that feeling comes at a cost, and that the cost is always paid by the one who feels, develop a way of keeping the people they loved in a drawer deep inside, in a place where it doesn't hurt as much, where it doesn't hinder the work of continuing to function. His mother's name was Consuelo. She had the most work-worn hands he had ever seen, and a way of laughing that filled her entire face. She had died when Fulgencio was 34, in a public hospital in the Doctores neighborhood, from an illness that could be cured with money, but killed without it. By then, he already had the company. By then, he could have paid for anything. But he was too late. He was always late for what mattered, because he was always busy building what he thought mattered. That was what he carried. That was the weight Cuca had seen without him telling her. Not the company, not the surname, not the 2.3 billion pesos from a construction firm he had built brick by brick. The guilt of having arrived late. His mother had told him once, he would have been 16, Rodrigo 12, and they were fighting over something he no longer remembered. She had said, "Fulgencio, the day you learn to ask for help, you'll be the strongest man in the world, because asking for help is the hardest thing there is, and it's the only thing that connects you with others." He had nodded, like a 16-year-old nods when they don't understand anything but don't want to admit it. It took him 36 years to understand what she had told him, and he understood it thanks to a girl from Oaxaca who had come to his house with a letter of recommendation, half truth, half desperation, and who, in a hospital room, speaking to a man she believed unconscious, had told him she loved him without asking for anything in return. Consuelo would have said something about that. Fulgencio didn't know exactly what, but he knew her well enough to know it would have been accurate, brief, and said with that laugh that filled her whole face. At 11 a.m., Doña Epifania entered the room alone, without saying anything to anyone, with that 81-year-old authority that doesn't ask permission because she has learned that permission is for people who don't know where they're going. She sat in the chair by the bed and looked at Fulgencio. "Ya," she said, "just that, like someone who has been waiting a long time and finally the other understands it's time." Fulgencio opened his eyes. The light hurt him, more than he expected. He blinked several times, letting the objects in the room take shape. The white ceiling, the monitor, the window with the city outside, the small table with ripe fruit and dry pan de muerto, and the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And Doña Epifania, sitting in the chair, chewing a tamarind candy with complete calm, looking at him as one looks at something they already knew they would see. "How long have you really been awake?" she asked. Fulgencio looked at her. "How long do you think?" he replied, his voice raspy from days of disuse. "From the beginning," said Doña Epifania without hesitation. "Or I've known you almost since you were 4 years old. Fulgencio, I know when you're asleep and when you're pretending to sleep." She paused. "Your mother used to do the same," Doña Epifania added. When something worried her greatly, she would remain still and wait to see what the world did. It was her way of thinking. Fulgencio looked at the ceiling. What the world saw, he said slowly, wasn't very encouraging. "No," admitted Doña Epifania. "But she also saw other things." She didn't say what. She didn't have to. They remained in silence for a while. The monitor beeped. The city outside continued with its usual noise. "She knows I heard," Fulgencio said at last. "No," said Doña Epifania. "What is she doing right now?" "She's in the hallway waiting for Norberto to finish making calls. She's been sitting in that horrible plastic chair for half an hour without complaining, because she's not one to complain." She paused. "Just like you, by the way, though, for different reasons." Fulgencio processed that. "I don't know what to do with what I heard," he said. It wasn't an excuse, but honesty that he found difficult. "I know," said Doña Epifania, "but you'll figure it out. Things clarify themselves when you stop running from them." She stood up, gathered her bag, and paused at the door. Just like Cuca, always at the door, as if this entire family thought about important things at the last moment before leaving. "Your mother would be proud," said Doña Epifania. "Not of what you built, but that you finally let yourself be seen." She left. Fulgencio remained alone, looked at the small table, the dry bread, the overripe fruit, the image of the Virgin. He reached out, the first time he had moved his arm with intention in 5 days, and touched the craft paper bag where the bread had come. It still smelled faintly of early morning bakery. He closed his fingers around the bag, and for the first time since he was 34, Fulgencio Aldama cried. Not much. Not the way people cry in movies, just a short, tight moment, the kind that makes no noise but weighs tons. The kind you've been keeping for decades and that, when it comes out on its own without asking permission. The monitor kept its rhythm. No one saw him. That was also fine. Rodrigo was in the hallway when the nurse came out of the room to find the doctor. He had spent the morning between calls and documents, coordinating the final details with Lear Heralde, verifying that the 4 missing board members were available for the emergency meeting he had convened for 3 p.m. Everything in order, everything in its place. The clock was ticking, and no one had told him anything that made him stop, until he saw Don Abundio. The doorman was still standing in front of the room's door, arms crossed. He had been there all morning. He hadn't moved at all, not even for the bathroom, which was statistically improbable for a man his age. And he had an expression Rodrigo had never seen before. Concentrated, serious, the look of someone doing something they considered important. "Don Abundio," said Rodrigo, his voice as kind as always. "I need to go in." "You can't," said Don Abundio. Rodrigo blinked. "Excuse me, you can't go in?" repeated Don Abundio, in the same tone he used for everything, without drama, without aggression, with the calm firmness of someone who has decided they are not moving today. "Doctor's orders. Only authorized personnel." "I'm family," said Rodrigo. "Ah, that's good," said Don Abundio. "But you can't go in anyway." Rodrigo looked at him for a second, gauged the situation, and smiled. "I'm going to speak with the nurse," he said, and walked down the hallway. Don Abundio followed him with his gaze, then said in a perfectly audible voice, "Go on, walk pretty." Norberto Villanueva was finishing his 3rd call when Rodrigo found him in the waiting room. He didn't know him. He saw a tall man with white hair, a phone in his hand, and the posture of someone who doesn't need to introduce himself for people to know who he is. "You are," said Rodrigo. "Norberto Villanueva," said the man. "Lawyer." He paused briefly. "And you?" "Rodrigo Aldama, the patient's brother." "What a coincidence," said Norberto. "I wanted to speak with you, actually." What followed was not a drama of shouting, not a cinematic confrontation with background music and elaborate monologues. It was something more uncomfortable and more real. A hushed conversation in a hospital waiting room, with plastic chairs and a silent television in the corner, where a man slowly understood, piece by piece, that the solid ground he thought he stood on had been glass for days. Norberto explained the situation with the clinical precision of someone who bills by the hour and wastes no words. The recording, its exact duration, its content, the crimes it constituted according to the Federal Penal Code, the corresponding penalties, the names mentioned in it, the anesthesiologist's name, Heralde's name, Rodrigo's name. Rodrigo listened to it all without interrupting. His face shifted through expressions. First disbelief, then the attempt at disbelief, then something closer to calculation, and finally, when Norberto finished, something akin to recognition, like when you know you've lost but are still processing how it happened. Who? Rodrigo asked, the question unfinished. The recording was made by Miss Refugio's phone, Norberto said, almost involuntarily. Voice memo function activated by accident. Pause. Justice has a sense of humor now and then. At 1:45 p.m., the door to room 418 opened. Cuca was in the hallway when it happened. She looked up, saw the attending physician, saw Norberto Villanueva, saw Doña Epifania with her purse and tamarind, and then she saw Fulgencio Aldama standing, the IV still in his left arm, because the doctor hadn't finished removing it, wearing a hospital gown, his hair unkempt, a 5-day stubble on his face, and an aura of occupying space that hadn't diminished 1 millimeter despite his days in bed. He looked at her, and Cuca didn't know what to do with that gaze. It was the first time in 8 months Fulgencio Aldama had looked at her directly, not sideways, not in passing, but straight on, with those dark eyes she had learned to read from afar, and which up close were something else entirely. Don Abundio, beside her, said aloud, "There's the señor." And then, softer, but not soft enough, "My God, what a serious face he has. But he's alive, how good." The Aldama Construction Board of Directors meeting was called for 4 p.m., not in the company boardroom, but at the hospital, in the multi-purpose room on the 3rd floor, because Fulgencio had no intention of waiting any longer. The doctor had said he needed to rest. Fulgencio had calmly told him he'd do it later. Edmundo Vargas arrived with the other 3 council members. They found Fulgencio seated at the head of the table, still in his gown, the IV removed but a bandage on his arm, and Norberto Villanueva to his right, with a laptop, a recorder, and 3 neatly arranged folders. Rodrigo was at the back of the room, standing, his tie loosened, and that smile that for the first time in his life didn't reach his eyes. Leralde hadn't arrived. Leralde, Norberto had been informed 15 minutes earlier, had requested an urgent meeting with his own lawyer. Fulgencio didn't give a speech. That would have been the last thing he'd do. Speeches were for people who needed to convince. He had a 17-minute, 42-second recording. Norberto played it, and the room listened to the entirety. When it finished, the silence lasted for several seconds. Edmundo Vargas was the first to speak. "The documents I signed yesterday," he said, his voice carefully measured, "were submitted under false information regarding Mr. Aldama's health." "Exactly," Norberto said, "and that makes them null and void, in addition to constituting the crime of procedural fraud." Vargas nodded and looked at Rodrigo. Rodrigo said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood, with the horrible clarity of inescapable moments, that anything he said in that room would be heard by people who had already made up their minds. "Rodrigo," Fulgencio said, the first time he had called him by his name all week, perhaps in the last decade. It had always been Rodrigo's matter, or talk to my brother, or silence, which was his preferred way of avoiding what hurt. Rodrigo looked at him. "Leave," Fulgencio said. He didn't yell. There was no accusation. No inventory of betrayals, just that single word spoken, with the exact tone of someone who has decided they've had enough and doesn't need to make noise for it to be noticed. Rodrigo left. What followed was work. Documents reviewed, signatures invalidated, agreements reversed. The anesthesiologist was suspended that same afternoon pending investigation. Lerald submitted his resignation the following day via email, without showing his face, which was precisely the kind of ending he deserved. Rodrigo was formally notified that he would face charges. Norberto was meticulous. Norberto left no loose ends. Doña Epifania, upon hearing the news, unwrapped a tamarind, chewed it calmly, and said, "Good, it's about time," and she said nothing more. Don Abundio, in the hallway, learned the outcome from Cuca, and said, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "See? What goes around comes around. I said it from the beginning." No one reminded him that he technically hadn't said it, but he deserved it. At 7 p.m., the room was empty. The council members had left. Norberto had gone to make more calls. Doña Epifania had declared she was hungry and had gone to find something decent to eat, because the hospital food was an insult to human dignity. Fulgencio remained alone at the table. Outside, in the hallway, was Cuca. He knew it. He could hear that particular silence that was hers. Still, not drawing attention, waiting without demanding that anyone notice she was waiting. Fulgencio looked at the door. He counted. This time he reached 3 and stood up. The door opened. Cuca looked up from the plastic chair. Fulgencio was in the doorway, still with the bandage on his arm, still in his gown, with that 5-day hospital face that didn't detract 1 ounce of weight from his presence. He looked at her. She looked at him. Don Abundio, seated 2 chairs away, glanced at one, then at the other, and said, excuse me." He stood up and walked down the hallway, with surprising speed for his age and build. Fulgencio approached. He sat in the chair Don Abundio had vacated. The uncomfortable, ungraceful hospital plastic chair, the furthest thing from his Lomas office, his 2-piece suits, and everything he had built to avoid sitting in plastic chairs ever again. He sat, clasped his hands, looked at the floor for a moment, then at her. "I heard everything," Cuca said. He didn't react immediately. He processed those 2 words, accommodated them, understood them, and when he truly understood them, all they implied, all she had said in that room, believing she was speaking to herself every night, all the confessions that had slipped out unintentionally, he felt the blood rush to his face in a way he couldn't control. "Everything," Fulgencio repeated, to leave no room for doubt. Cuca looked toward the other end of the hallway. "Ah," she said, which at that moment was the only thing in her vocabulary. There was a silence, not uncomfortable, strangely not uncomfortable, for the silence between 2 people when one has just discovered the other, heard her confess her love while believing she was unconscious. "You were going to come anyway," Fulgencio said at last. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Cuca said, her voice calm, recovered. She was good at recovering, even if no one was listening. "I know." Another silence. "The bread was very good," Fulgencio said. Cuca looked at him. "It was dry," she said. "At 4 a.m., any bread is good." Cuca didn't know if it was a joke. Fulgencio's face didn't help. It never helped. It was a face that announced nothing in advance, but there was something in his tone that wasn't his usual tone. It was closer to the 3-second laugh she had kept, as if it were her own. "I have something to tell you," Fulgencio said. He said it slowly, like someone unaccustomed to saying certain things and measuring each word more carefully than usual. "I'm not good at this, at talking about what matters to me, at letting things matter, if it comes to that. I spent many years convincing myself that was strength." Cuca listened without interrupting. "It wasn't," she said. "It was something else. Loneliness, probably, but I gave it another name, because I liked that one better." A pause. "My aunt says I resemble my mother," he continued. "Not the good parts, but the part about staying quiet when I should speak." He looked at his hands. "She was right about that, like about almost everything." "Your mother," Cuca said softly. "Doña Epifania, although she also talks about my mother." "Yes." A small pause. "They were both right. What you said," Fulgencio said, without beating around the bush, because circumlocution wasn't his thing, even though direct words were difficult for him. "What you said in that room, the nights you came, the bread, the book, the staying, even though no one asked you to, He stopped. "I don't know what to do with that yet. I have no experience with that kind of thing." "I know," Cuca said, "but I want to learn." She said it without telenovela romance, without imaginary music, with the same voice she used to sign contracts or give instructions, direct, unadorned, with the weight of someone who says what she says because she thought it and because she means it. Cuca looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know how to ask either," she said finally, "if that helps." "Then we'll be 2 who don't know," Fulgencio said. "That doesn't sound very promising." "No," he admitted, "but it's honest." And Cuca, who had spent her whole life valuing honesty above almost anything else, couldn't find an argument against it. Don Abundio had disappeared down the hallway, but reappeared 10 minutes later with 2 coffees from the vending machine, which he delivered with the discretion of someone pretending not to be listening and who was listening to absolutely everything. "For the cold," Don Abundio said without looking at either of them. It's hot, Don Abundio, Cuca said. For the cold of the soul, Don Abundio said with impeccable dignity, and left again. Fulgencio looked at the coffee, then at Cuca, and for the first time in 52 years, Fulgencio Aldama truly laughed in the presence of another person. Not a 3-second laugh, with his eyes closed for a moment, but with that laugh that Cuca had kept as if it were her own, and which now, somehow, was hers. Doña Epifania appeared down the hallway 20 minutes later, with a plastic bag from the corner fonda. She had found one that stayed open late and made a beef broth that, according to her, was the only decent thing within a 3-kilometer radius of the hospital. She stopped when she saw the two of them sitting together in the plastic chairs, coffees in hand, and something different in the hallway's atmosphere. Something that hadn't been there before. She looked at them. She nodded. Good, she said. The same thing she had said days earlier in the room. Apparently to no one. Now it was for someone. For both of them. She entered the room without further comment, took out her beef broth, sat down, and began to eat with the tranquility of someone who has lived long enough to know that good endings don't need fanfare. 3 weeks later, Cuca was still working at the house in Lomas, of her own volition. Fulgencio had asked her awkwardly, with too many words for such a simple question, and she had said yes, that for the moment she preferred things to shift space, that she wasn't one to jump without seeing the floor. He had said that sounded fine to him, and he had said it with a face that was different from all the faces she had seen on him before, less closed, less tight, like when a window that had been sealed for a long time opens a centimeter and a little air comes in, and it turns out the room doesn't fall down. Cuca's father's debt was being handled by Norberto Villanueva, who had reviewed the original documents and found sufficient irregularities to contest it. He hadn't promised anything, but he said there was a lot to work with. Cuca hadn't asked Fulgencio to get involved. He had found out from Doña Epifania, as always, and had called Norberto without telling her. When Cuca found out, she asked, "Why?" "Because I can," Fulgencio said. "That's not a reason," Cuca said. Fulgencio looked at her. "Why do I care?" he said with his usual visible effort. But having said it, Cuca didn't reply. It wasn't necessary. Elir, the gardener, who found out everything from Don Abundio, who else? Spent the following Tuesday pruning the bushes with his usual seriousness. But as he finished, he paused at the gate and spoke to Cuca, who happened to be passing by. "I'm glad the master is well." "Me too," Cuca replied. "And that you are well too," Eleazar added. Cuca looked at him, surprised. Eleazar had already turned, walking toward his truck. He wasn't a man for explanations. No one in that house was. Don Abundio, on the afternoon of the first day Fulgencio returned to the mansion, waited for him at the entrance, hat in hand, his face a mask of someone with something prepared, rehearsed for days. Fulgencio stepped out of the car. Don Abundio opened his mouth and, with a voice more choked with emotion than he had planned, said, "Welcome home, sir." His voice faltered slightly there, and he blinked, looking away. Fulgencio regarded him for a moment, placed a hand on his shoulder. Nothing more, no grand pronouncements. Don Abundio nodded, put on his hat, and walked toward the guardhouse with a dignified stride. From within, a few seconds later, his voice rang out, completely audible as always. "Oh, I almost burst into tears. How embarrassing, dear lord." Fulgencio entered the house. It was the same rooms with their names, the same dinnerware steeped in history, the same garden belonging to Eleazar. But something had shifted in the way he saw it, or perhaps in the way he himself moved within it. Less tense, less like someone just passing through his own world. In the kitchen, the Wednesday chicken soup was ready, even though it was Thursday. Cuca emerged from the pantry with a bag of rice, and saw him standing in the kitchen entrance. She raised her eyebrows slightly, as if asking, "It smells good," Fulgencio said. "It's from yesterday," Cuca replied. "I reheated it." "That's fine." He sat down in the kitchen chair, the usual one, the one no one used when he was around, because no one dared to occupy the kitchen when the master was home. And Cuca served him the soup without another word. And he ate it without another word. And outside, Eleazar's garden was perfectly pruned, and Don Abundio was in his guardhouse, likely talking to himself aloud. And Doña Epifania was somewhere in the city, being Doña Epifania, which was enough for any universe. And the house that Cuca had once said felt empty without him, no longer felt empty. It felt for the first time in a long time like what it was. A home where someone lived. not just where someone came to sleep after building things. That was enough, for now.